Hernandez live now. Lance, the filing of charges was actually delayed today because Guzman wouldn't leave her cell.
Mike, she was due in court this morning, but court officials told us she didn't want to leave her jail cell at the Arapahoe County Detention Center. Isabella Guzman now facing first-degree murder charges. She was charged with first-degree murder after stabbing her mom about 79 times in the face and neck at this house in Aurora. The 18-year-old smirked at the camera as she stood up and walked to the defense table this afternoon, her arms and legs shackled. After the judge read the complaint against her, she looked over, stared at the camera, and motioned to the area under each of her eyes with her index finger. Court documents indicate that Isabella Guzman had a contentious relationship with her mom, and that her mom was concerned enough that she called police on August 28th. They came to the house and told Isabella that her mom could kick her out for her behavior. It seemed to calm her down. But later that evening, after her mom went upstairs to take a shower, Guzman's stepdad heard a thump, ran upstairs, and saw blood oozing out from under the bathroom door. Court documents indicate that he later saw Guzman exit the bathroom with a knife in her hand, staring straight ahead and not saying a word. Now, we tried to contact Guzman's stepfather. He wasn't home. A cleaning crew telling us that he may never return to this house. We did find these two dumpsters, though, filled with stuffed animals, some jewelry, and other belongings. It's obvious that somebody didn't want this stuff in the house. By the way, Guzman due back in court next Friday. In Aurora, Lance Hernandez, 7 News.
You know, some moments stay with you. And one of them is the sight of an 18-year-old girl sitting in a Colorado courtroom with a small smile that didn't belong there. She didn't look scared or remorseful, and that expression would later flood social media with people asking how someone could sit like that after what happened in her own home. But long before the cameras, there was a mother named Jennifer Moy, working long hours, keeping a kitchen light glowing at night, trying to reach a daughter who felt farther away each passing month. Their home carried arguments, quiet apologies, and the hope that tomorrow would be better than today. Officers later said, "We responded to a residence in Aurora, but nothing could capture what waited behind the bathroom door, and no one knew the note Isabella left that morning would be the last message her mother ever read, because Jennifer never realized her daughter wasn't looking at her anymore. She was looking at someone else entirely." It was August 28th, 2013, and Colorado woke up the way it usually does, with sunlight stretching across quiet neighborhoods, and families settling into their routines without the faintest idea that life inside one particular house was about to break forever. Downstairs, Jennifer Moy moved the laundry from the washer to the dryer like she had done 100 times before, and the scent of detergent drifted through the air while cereal bowls sat half full on the table from the night before. Outside, neighbors walked their dogs, kids rode scooters across the sidewalk, and everything looked so ordinary that even the house itself seemed to carry the calm of a normal morning. Jennifer told her stepfather, Ryan, she was going upstairs to take a shower, and he nodded without thinking twice, because that's what mornings looked like in that home. Simple, predictable, familiar. But the moment she closed the bathroom door, something shifted in the walls, something that felt like silence pressing a little too hard, and Ryan would later tell officers in the affidavit, "I thought everything was fine. There was nothing unusual." Those are the words people say before the truth shatters their memory of a room forever. A few minutes passed, and Ryan moved through the kitchen the way any man would on an ordinary morning, his focus shifting from the counter to the fridge to the pile of mail near the sink. The house stayed still, and the only sound was the steady hum of the dryer downstairs, until a soft thud broke the quiet. A sound light enough for doubt, but sharp enough for instinct. He paused mid-step, trying to figure out whether it came from upstairs, or if it was just something falling off a shelf. But the unease grew stronger when he noticed Jennifer's phone buzzing on the counter, untouched. He later told investigators, her phone kept lighting up, but she didn't come down, and that detail became one of those small moments that haunts the mind because of everything it failed to warn. Ryan started toward the stairs, each step slower than the last, the kind of slow you take when your body knows something before your head does. Then came another faint sound, one you can't explain but also can't ignore, and that was the moment his heart began to race for reasons he couldn't put into words. As he reached the top of the stairs, the air felt heavier, as if the hallway itself was holding its breath, and Ryan walked toward the bathroom door, feeling his hands go cold. He knocked once and called out, "Jen, you okay?" But there was no answer, just the whisper of running water behind the door, and for 1 second he thought she might be drying off or brushing her hair. But silence wrapped back around him, and something in it told him he couldn't wait any longer. He turned the knob slowly at first, then pushed harder when it resisted, and when the door finally cracked open, the scene inside stopped him in a way no human heart is built to process. All he could say later, his voice breaking in the recorded interview, was, "I saw her on the floor, and there was so much blood. I didn't understand what I was looking at." And in that moment, time ceased to behave normally, folding in on itself until everything became a blur of shock and disbelief. He stumbled backward, his breath collapsing, and rushed for the phone while trying to speak but failing because every word jammed in his throat. The 911 call from that morning still carries the sound of a man fighting to force out the truth, his voice shaking as he said, "My wife. She's been attacked. She's in the bathroom. Please send someone now." Dispatch told him to stay on the line, to stay outside the house, to breathe, but none of those instructions could steady a man who had just watched his world fall apart in a single glance. The operator asked, "Do you know who did this?" And Ryan's answer would later echo across the investigation. "I think it was Isabella. She was just here, and now she's gone." Those words changed everything because they became the moment when fear turned to horror, and the officers en route realized the suspect wasn't a stranger hiding in the shadows. It was the daughter who used to sit at that same kitchen table. When police arrived minutes later, they moved with urgency, stepping past the laundry basket, past the quiet kitchen, and up the stairs where the air felt colder than the rest of the house. They found Jennifer exactly where Ryan had said, and even seasoned officers paused at the doorway because scenes like that do not fade from memory, not after the number of wounds, not after the violence that had taken place in a room meant for privacy and routine. One officer later wrote in his report, "It was clear she had suffered multiple injuries, a line so restrained that it barely hints at the truth, but that restraint is what officers use when words fail them." The yellow tape went up quickly. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains with hands over their mouths, and detectives tried to trace what had happened in those final minutes between mother and daughter. Someone whispered, "Where is the girl?" And that question traveled from officer to officer until it reached the one standing closest to the doorway. He swallowed hard, looked at the scene again, and understood what the absence meant. Isabella wasn't in the bedroom, the hall, the backyard, or anywhere in the house where a scared teenager might hide. The officers searched every corner, their radios crackling with updates, and one noted in his log, "No sign of the suspect on premises," a fact that landed with a weight that tightened every chest in the room. Moments like this change the trajectory of an entire investigation because shock turns into urgency, and urgency turns into fear of what the suspect might do next. The house filled with the muffled sounds of radios, whispers, and footsteps, but beneath all of it was the quiet truth no one was ready to say out loud. The person responsible for what happened in that bathroom wasn't hiding from the police. She had already walked away. And yet, Isabella was nowhere in that house. The investigation officially began within minutes of officers confirming Jennifer's condition, and detectives entered the house with a focus sharpened by urgency, knowing every second mattered when the primary suspect was a teenager who had vanished without a trace. They started by examining the upstairs hallway, where the first responding officer pointed out a crumpled slip of paper tucked near the wall, a note that read, "You will pay," in handwriting later confirmed to be Isabella's. That discovery immediately shifted the direction of the investigation from a possible break-in to a case centered entirely within the family, a shift that stunned even seasoned detectives who had seen years of domestic cases but rarely one involving a daughter so young. What struck investigators even more were the subtle signs of friction inside the home, details gathered from conversations with relatives who mentioned a growing distance between Isabella and her mother, especially in the months leading up to the attack. One detective later said in an interview, "There were concerns, yes, but nothing that pointed to something like this. a statement that showed how easily danger can grow unnoticed behind closed doors. And with Isabella missing, every scrap of information felt like a crucial puzzle piece that might point toward where she had gone and what state of mind she was in when she left the house. As investigators tracked Jennifer's final hours, they reconstructed the day with precision, reviewing her last text messages and calls with a care that reflected both respect and determination to understand her final moments. The last message she sent was to a co-worker confirming a shift detail, and the co-worker later told officers she sounded fine. There was nothing unusual in her voice, reinforcing that Jennifer had no idea what waited upstairs. Detectives then moved to the family phone records, studying the timeline of activity from both Jennifer and Isabella, noting the silence that fell over Isabella's phone after the time of the attack. They mapped out the hours: 12 hours missing, 18 hours, 24. Each mark on the timeline widened the emotional distance between what they knew and what they feared, creating a rhythm of urgency that shaped every decision they made. The more they studied those final communications, the clearer it became that the house held tensions no one fully understood, and Jennifer had been trying, quietly, steadily, to keep her daughter from slipping further away. And as each new detail emerged, it became harder to imagine how someone who shared so many years under the same roof could walk out so calmly after what happened upstairs. Later that afternoon, detectives held their first briefing outside the house, and reporters gathered behind the barricade as the lead investigator stepped forward, adjusting his radio and delivering the first public statement of the case. He said, "We are asking for the public's help in locating 18-year-old Isabella Guzman. She may be on foot, and we need to speak with her immediately." His tone was controlled, steady, but anyone who listens to the recording can hear the tension beneath the surface, a tension built on the knowledge that time was slipping away. Inside the house, crime scene technicians documented the upstairs hallway, the bathroom, and the stairwell, while detectives sifted through drawers, notebooks, and discarded envelopes, looking for anything that could offer insight into Isabella's mental state. They found recent writings that contained phrases showing hostility toward her mother, but none that clearly explained the level of violence used. One officer later said privately, "Something else was going on with her. This wasn't just anger," and those words became the first thread that hinted at a deeper, unfamiliar layer beneath the conflict. By early evening, investigators began receiving calls from neighbors who had heard about the situation and wanted to offer what little details they remembered from the hours after the murder. Several neighbors reported seeing Isabella walking through the neighborhood shortly after noon, and one woman told officers, "She wasn't in a hurry. She was just walking like she always does." That detail unsettled detectives because it suggested a lack of panic or awareness of the severity of what had occurred, something that didn't align with the typical behavior of someone fleeing a violent scene. Another witness said, "She didn't look scared. She didn't look upset. She just looked blank." And that observation added weight to the emerging theory that Isabella may not have been fully connected to reality when she left the house. At that point, investigators broadened their search radius, monitoring bus stops, nearby stores, and pedestrian routes she had used in the past, hoping she would appear somewhere predictable. What became clear was that investigators weren't chasing a girl who was hiding. They were tracing the path of someone moving through the world without clear awareness of what she had left behind. As the interviews progressed, detectives began piecing together comments from friends and relatives who described unusual behavior in the days leading up to the murder, details that had seemed strange at the time but now took on far more meaning. One classmate told officers, "She said she wasn't safe at home. She said her mom wasn't her mom." A statement included in the official report and later echoed by others who had witnessed her growing detachment. Another person close to the family explained that Isabella had expressed odd beliefs, mentioning someone named Cecilia, and insisting that something harmful was targeting her, though she never clarified what that meant. These testimonies painted a picture not of rage but of confusion, fear, and a disconnection from reality that made the crime even harder for investigators to understand. A detective noted in his report, "There are indications of disorganized thinking, signaling the first formal recognition that this case might fall outside the boundaries of typical criminal intent." And as they reviewed each statement, The team realized they were chasing not just a missing suspect, but a state of mind unraveling long before the attack took place. By the next morning, law enforcement expanded the search to local transit stations, trails, and public areas Isabella had visited in the past, hoping she might reappear somewhere familiar. Officers checked security cameras at convenience stores and bus terminals, scanning footage for any sign of her distinct clothing or recognizable gait. Around midday, a call came in from a nearby shopping center where someone believed they had seen a girl matching Isabella's description near a loading dock, and officers moved quickly to the location. When they arrived, she was standing alone, leaning against a wall with her arms folded, not attempting to escape, not attempting to hide, but simply existing as though nothing around her belonged to her. The moment officers approached, she lifted her head slowly, and one of them later recounted, "She didn't seem alarmed. She just looked at us like she expected we would show up eventually." Detectives finally found her, but she wasn't hiding. She was standing in plain sight. But the strangest part wasn't where she was found. It was how she looked at them. When officers finally approached Isabella near the loading dock that afternoon, their steps were cautious but firm, expecting a teenager who might run or collapse or show some sign of awareness about what had taken place hours earlier. Instead, she turned her head slowly and looked at them with an expression so detached it made the air around them feel colder, her eyes drifting over their uniforms like they were strangers asking for directions. One officer later recalled in his report, "She didn't seem scared. She didn't seem confused. She just watched us." And the uncertainty in his voice reflected how unusual it was to approach someone who should have been trembling but wasn't. When they told her, "Isabella, we need you to come with us," she didn't protest or hesitate, simply placing her wrists forward with a look that carried no understanding of why that moment mattered. As they secured the handcuffs, she whispered something too soft for the microphones to catch, and officers noted she seemed to be talking to someone who wasn't there. A detail that would later become a critical part of her evaluation. And as they led her to the patrol car, not a single tear, question, or plea came from her, only the quiet shuffle of her steps as if she had been expecting this walk all along. The drive to the station was quiet, and the dash camera captured her reflection in the window, her face blank and her posture relaxed, in a way detectives could not understand, given the gravity of the situation. One officer attempted to read her Miranda rights, repeating, "You have the right to remain silent," and she stared straight ahead without responding, blinking slowly like the words were drifting past her without landing. Another officer later said, "It was like she wasn't fully present, like she wasn't sitting in that seat with us," which echoed the same observation about her detachment from the moment she was found. When they arrived, she stepped out of the vehicle calmly, walking into the station with the same pace she had used earlier, showing no hesitation, no distress, and no urgency to explain or deny anything. In the booking area, she followed instructions effortlessly, lifting her chin for the camera, turning left and right and signing her name without the slightest tremor in her hand. Detectives watching her through the glass began to realize that they weren't dealing with a typical suspect at all, but someone whose emotional register didn't match the reality around her. Inside the interrogation room, Isabella sat with her hands folded, staring at the table as though the patterns in the wood grain held more meaning than the investigators standing in front of her. The lead detective sat down and began with a measured tone, saying, "Isabella, we need to talk about what happened at the house today." But she didn't respond, only glancing upward with a faint, fleeting smile that unsettled the room. They asked if she understood why she was there, and she tilted her head slightly before whispering, "She wasn't supposed to be there." The first words she had spoken clearly since the arrest. When pressed on what she meant, she repeated softly, "She wasn't my mother." A statement initially dismissed as shock until the psychiatrist on call requested immediate evaluation. Interrogators exchanged looks, realizing the conversation had moved into territory none of them were prepared for, and the detective wrote in his notes, "Her affect is flat, responses disconnected, possible underlying mental health issue." And as the clock ticked on, Isabella remained quiet, occasionally smiling at the corner of the room, as though someone only she could see were standing there. When the psychiatric evaluation began later that evening, doctors spoke with deliberate care, trying to separate trauma from delusion, grief from breaking reality, but it became clear within minutes that something much deeper was taking shape. During the assessment, Isabella explained in a calm voice, "The woman in the house wasn't my mom. She was Cecilia," referencing an identity investigators had never heard before. When asked to clarify who Cecilia was, she responded, "She was trying to hurt me. She took her place." And doctors recognized the hallmark signs of a misidentification delusion, a severe symptom often seen in individuals experiencing psychosis. One clinician later wrote in her report, "Subject exhibits signs of paranoid ideation and disorganized thinking," and that line became a turning point in the case, shifting the focus from anger to severe mental disturbance. Another doctor asked, "When did you first believe your mother wasn't your mother?" And Isabella answered, "A while. She changed. I could see it in her eyes." The room fell silent because those words didn't match the reality detectives knew, but they perfectly matched the patterns doctors were trained to recognize. Court documents from September 2013 revealed that during one session, Isabella described hearing voices that told her she needed to stop Cecilia before something terrible happened, reinforcing the depth of her mental break. A doctor later testified, "She genuinely believed she was acting to protect herself. She did not understand she was attacking her actual mother." This testimony became one of the earliest anchors for the insanity evaluation, demonstrating to the court that Isabella's mind had fractured in a way that detached her entirely from the meaning of her actions. Meanwhile, detectives reviewed surveillance footage from the hours after the attack, and the images showed Isabella walking calmly across parking lots, sitting on benches, and looking into store windows as though she were simply passing time. One officer who viewed the footage said, "It didn't look like someone fleeing. It looked like someone wandering," a detail that reinforced the emerging picture of her mental collapse. And through every piece of footage, her expression never shifted into fear, guilt, or urgency, only a distant calm that felt unsettlingly out of place. As the investigation formed a clearer picture, the courtroom proceedings began, and Isabella entered wearing the standard jumpsuit with the same detached calm she had shown from the beginning. Observers noticed her staring upward at the ceiling lights, brushing her hair back, and even smiling faintly as attorneys spoke about evidence and testimony in a tone that should have grounded her in what she was facing. Reporters in the courtroom later noted that at one point she laughed softly, prompting confusion and unease among those present. And that moment, years later, would become the viral TikTok clip that millions reacted to with disbelief. When asked by the judge if she understood the charges against her, she looked at him, blinked slowly, and remained silent, prompting the judge to exchange a glance with the defense attorney before noting, "She appears unable to comprehend these proceedings." The courtroom transcript also recorded the judge telling the room, "Mental health evaluations will continue. This is not a typical case." And as the quiet murmurs spread through the courtroom, it became clear this case would not follow the familiar path of guilt and punishment. The emotional weight of the situation deepened when psychiatric testimony began, with experts explaining in calm clinical language how Isabella's mind had detached from reality long before the events of August 28th. One doctor testified, "She suffered from active psychosis and could not distinguish her delusion from truth." And the judge listened with an expression that betrayed both disbelief and concern. In a soft voice, another expert added, "She did not recognize her mother. She recognized a threat she believed was real." A statement that shook the room because it forced everyone to confront a truth that had no easy moral resolution. Reporters scribbled notes, attorneys shifted in their chairs, and even seasoned officers felt the atmosphere shift as the testimony painted a picture of a girl living inside a world none of them could see. The judge sat back, hands clasped, and took a long breath before addressing the courtroom, understanding fully that the decision ahead would carry a weight beyond legal procedure. And in that moment, as the room waited for his words, the truth settled in with a heaviness no one could ignore. He looked at Isabella, then at the attorneys, and finally at the reports stacked in front of him. and the courtroom went still because everyone knew they were about to hear something that would define the trajectory of the case. The judge's voice was measured as he began to speak, but the impact of his decision would echo far beyond that single moment. People online saw a smile. Doctors saw a break from reality. And the judge wasn't speaking to a killer. He was speaking to a mind that had shattered. From the moment the trial began, Jennifer's family sat in the courtroom with an ache that no language can soften, their faces drawn tight as they tried to understand how a daughter they had raised, loved, and worried over had become the center of a case that shattered their world. They listened as the charges were read, each word landing heavier than the last, and Jennifer's relatives later told reporters, "We just want answers. We want to understand how this happened," because the confusion sat right beside grief. When the prosecution laid out the timeline, Jennifer's sister covered her mouth with her hands, unable to hold back the tears that came with hearing her loved one's final moments described in a courtroom filled with strangers. Family members whispered prayers under their breath, clutching tissues as they waited for any explanation that could bridge the impossible gap between the child they remembered and the events that unfolded in that bathroom. It was a silence carved out of pain, one that deepened with every minute the judge spoke. And through it all, the absence of Jennifer, the mother, the friend, the woman who left a kitchen light on out of love, hung over the room like a weight no ruling could lift. Outside the courthouse, the community formed its own judgment long before the legal system reached its conclusion, and the case became the talk of Aurora, spilling from living rooms into coffee shops and church steps. People questioned how such a young girl could inflict that level of violence, and the debates grew louder as more details emerged about the number of wounds and the brutality involved. Neighbors who once saw Isabella walking to school now struggled to reconcile the girl they knew with the headlines they were hearing, saying to reporters, "It just doesn't make sense. She didn't seem like someone who could do this." Online discussions erupted across comment sections, with some arguing she should face the full force of the law, and others insisting that mental illness plays a role the justice system can't ignore. Colorado Talk shows invited experts to discuss insanity defenses, and callers voiced anger, confusion, and fear about what the case meant for accountability. The public conversation became its own storm, one fueled by emotion, ethics, and the very human desire to make sense of the unthinkable. Inside the courtroom, the emotional tension thickened as the first expert witness took the stand, a psychiatrist who had spent hours evaluating Isabella in the weeks following her arrest. He testified, "She met the criteria for severe schizophrenia," and explained to the court how her delusions distorted her ability to interpret reality, her beliefs shifting her perception of danger in ways she could not control. Another doctor explained that Isabella reported hearing voices instructing her to act, stating in the affidavit, she believed she had a mission to stop someone she called Cecilia, which clarified why she insisted the woman she attacked was not her mother. The courtroom fell into a heavy stillness as the expert added, "She genuinely believed she was protecting herself. There was no understanding of the consequences or of who she was harming." Jurors listened, scribbling notes, trying to reconcile the chilling details of the attack with the clinical explanations of a fractured mind. And with each new piece of testimony, the case pulled further away from the realm of intentional violence and deeper into the reality of untreated psychosis. The prosecution, usually resistant to insanity pleas, presented its own medical evaluations, and what shocked the courtroom most was their agreement with the defense experts. One prosecutor stated plainly, "We do not believe she understood the nature of her actions," a position so rare that reporters in the gallery exchanged glances, aware they were witnessing something seldom seen in this type of case. The prosecution acknowledged that the evidence supported a finding of legal insanity, a stance that sparked immediate reactions from the public, many of whom struggled to accept such a position given the severity of the crime. As one legal analyst said on a local broadcast, "This is an extraordinary moment, the state and defense aligning on mental competency," highlighting just how unusual the case had become. Even the judge paused before moving forward, making sure the jury understood the weight of two sides agreeing on a psychological collapse rather than a malicious intent. This rare alignment between prosecution and defense became one of the defining moments in the trial, reshaping how the community understood the case. When family members were given the chance to speak, their grief filled the room in ways no testimony could match, each voice carrying the ache of a life cut short. A relative said through tears, "Jennifer was a mother who tried her best. She didn't deserve this." And another added, "We will never understand why this happened." Their words pierced the courtroom because they came from people who had lived through love, loss, and bewilderment all at once. The judge listened with solemn eyes, acknowledging the pain that could not be erased by explanations or diagnoses, and the gallery remained silent, each listener absorbing the magnitude of their loss. These statements revealed the emotional cost that extended beyond evidence and psychiatric terms, grounding the case in the real, everyday heartbreak of a family who would never be the same. And in that moment, even those who believed in the insanity ruling felt the full weight of what had been taken from them. As the verdict approached, the courtroom settled into an uneasy quiet, the kind that comes when everyone knows they are about to witness something that cannot be undone. The judge reviewed the reports again, then turned to the room and stated plainly, "Based on all medical evidence presented, the defendant is found not guilty by reason of insanity." Gasps echoed from the gallery, and one family member buried their face in their hands, overwhelmed by the complexity of justice meeting tragedy. The judge continued, "She will be committed to the Colorado Mental Health Institute in Pueblo for treatment," making it clear that this was not a release, but an indefinite placement based on her mental state. Courtroom audio captured the shuffle of feet, the soft weeping of relatives, and the heavy exhale of attorneys who understood how rare and profound the ruling was. The decision marked the end of the trial, but not the end of the questions that hovered over everyone present. And as the judge delivered the final lines, the truth settled deep into the room. She faced the judge, but her mother faced forever. Isabella was found not guilty by reason of insanity, and ordered to remain under state care until doctors and the court determined she no longer posed a danger, a process with no guaranteed timeline and no certainty about what her future would hold. Reporters outside delivered the news to cameras with tones that mixed shock with solemn reflection, acknowledging that the case had forced the community to confront the painful intersection of mental illness and violent crime. Family members left the courthouse clutching one another, their steps slow, their eyes red, carrying a burden that would follow them long after the cameras shut off. And in homes across Colorado, conversations continued late into the night about justice, mental health, and the complicated reality of what the ruling meant. But her story didn't end with the verdict. When Isabella entered the Colorado Mental Health Institute in Pueblo, her life shifted into a world defined by locked hallways, scheduled medication, and constant observation, a stark contrast to the freedom she had walked through with such detachment in the hours after the killing. Staff kept detailed notes on her daily behavior, documenting moments when she appeared calm, withdrawn, or distracted by voices no one else could hear, and these records became part of her long-term evaluation. One report noted, "Patient shows periods of stability followed by episodes of disorganized thinking, a reminder that her condition did not simply vanish with the verdict." Doctors met with her regularly, adjusting her treatment as they monitored her response to antipsychotic medication, and over time they observed stretches where the delusions quieted, allowing her to speak more clearly about her internal world. Even then, she often described her past with confusion, telling staff members during one session, "I didn't know it was my mother," a statement that remained consistent throughout her treatment. Her life became a series of routines: therapy, observation, medication, and evaluation, a cycle with no guaranteed endpoint. The institution itself carried an atmosphere shaped by the weight of the patients inside, and Isabella's days followed a structured rhythm meant to stabilize those who struggled to distinguish reality from their own inner fears. She attended group therapy sessions where patients spoke about their conditions, but several staff members noted that Isabella often listened more than she contributed, offering brief comments only when prompted. In her private sessions, she sometimes admitted to hearing voices in the past that convinced her she was in danger, and in one documented conversation she said softly, "They told me she wasn't who she said she was," referring again to the imagined figure she called Cecilia. Over the years, her psychological assessments showed progress, but they also revealed lingering symptoms that made doctors cautious about any discussion of possible release. One clinician explained in a hearing transcript, "The risk factors associated with her illness are ongoing," a statement that underscored the seriousness of her condition. And although she lived in a controlled environment, her presence there remained a reminder of the day untreated psychosis collided with tragedy. For a long time, the world forgot about the case, filing it away as another tragic but contained story, until years later, when a 10-second courtroom clip resurfaced online and transformed a somber legal proceeding into viral entertainment. TikTok users shared the footage of Isabella smiling, brushing her hair back, and glancing toward the gallery, but most of them had no idea what led to that moment or what it meant. Comment sections filled with speculation, shock, and a mix of fascination and judgment, with one user writing, "Why is she smiling like that?" and another responding, "This case is terrifying." As the clip spread, national outlets revisited the story, and headlines once again carried Isabella's name, but this time framed within the language of viral culture rather than tragedy. Journalists who had covered the original trial found themselves answering questions about the context behind the clip because so many viewers were reacting without understanding the mental health element. And while the internet dissected her expression, the deeper truth, that it reflected a fractured mind, not amusement, was lost beneath the noise of social media algorithms. The resurgence of the video sparked a new wave of conversations about mental illness, accountability, and the role of viral content in shaping public opinion, with commentators acknowledging how quickly a life-altering tragedy can become distorted online. Television hosts revisited the case on late-night segments, and true crime forums reignited debates about the insanity ruling, with some users arguing, "She should have gone to prison," while others countered, "She was clearly not in touch with reality." Modern news clips, when available, included statements from mental health professionals who urged viewers to remember the clinical findings behind the verdict, stating, "Psychosis is not a choice, and delusions can completely distort a person's perception." Yet even with these explanations, many people focused more on her courtroom expression than on the mother whose life had been lost. The clip's popularity created a troubling shift in attention, placing Isabella at the center of the narrative, while Jennifer's memory faded in the background. It was a painful reminder of how digital culture often elevates the spectacle while overlooking the human cost. Jennifer's family felt this shift deeply, struggling with the reality that the woman they loved was now often mentioned only in connection to a viral smile rather than for the life she lived. During a brief interview, a relative quietly said, "Her name was Jennifer. People forget that." A statement that cut through the noise of online curiosity with raw truth. The victim impact statements from the trial reflected their heartbreak, and years later, nothing about that pain had softened. In the spaces where Jennifer once existed, her kitchen, her yard, her routines, her absence echoed louder than any courtroom footage ever could. The family faced anniversaries that brought back memories they never asked to carry. And each year, they lit the small kitchen light she always left on, a gesture that kept her presence alive in the one place that still belonged to her. Her mother had a name, and it wasn't the woman from the TikTok case. As debates spread across social platforms and news segments, one question continued to divide the public. Can someone who killed under psychosis ever be safely released? Legal experts weighed in, explaining that insanity commitments are not time-based but treatment-based, meaning release is considered only if doctors and courts agree that the individual no longer poses a danger. Some mental health professionals emphasize that proper medication and long-term care can stabilize someone with schizophrenia, while others warn that the risk of relapse must be taken seriously. Families affected by similar cases offered their own perspectives, acknowledging that the justice system must balance compassion with public safety. Isabella's evaluations continued behind closed doors, where doctors tracked her progress and monitored her understanding of her illness. Knowing the stakes of their assessments carried enormous weight, and the public watched from afar, left with questions that had no simple answers. Through all the noise and debates, one truth remained. The story was never just about a courtroom smile or a viral clip. It was about a family shattered, a mother whose life was taken, and a daughter caught inside a mind she could not control. The legacy of the case stretched far beyond legal documents, touching conversations about mental health reform, early intervention, and the gaps that allow untreated psychosis to escalate into irreversible tragedy. In Jennifer's home, her family kept her memory alive with quiet acts of love, returning each year to the place where she spent her last morning, placing their hands on the counter she once wiped down, and turning on the small kitchen light she always left glowing. That light became their way of saying she was still part of their lives, even in the moments when grief felt unbearable. And on the nights when the house settled into its familiar stillness, that faint glow carried the weight of everything she never got to finish. The kitchen light Jennifer always left on still burns during anniversaries, its glow a reminder that some losses never dim. You know, stories like this remind us how fragile families are. One moment you're arguing over chores or curfews. The next you're replaying every missed sign, every unspoken word. Jennifer's story is not a headline. It's a reminder that behind every tragedy, there's a home, a heartbeat, a mother who loved her child. And while the courts handed down a ruling, the truth is, grief doesn't follow legal decisions. It follows memory. If this story stayed with you, let her name stay with you too. Because remembering someone is its own form of justice, quiet but powerful. If this story moved you, share her name, because memory is its own kind of justice.